We are joined now by Mike German, who is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program, author of Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Democracy. And Mike, you're working on a new book about white supremacist violence, and that's going to be published next year, it seems. Mike, thanks so much for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So you're a former FBI agent. You infiltrated white supremacist groups in the 1990s. And I'm just curious about your experience with that. Obviously, scary work. But how would you say your work, from your perspective, fits into the Bureau's broader history of racism, like in terms of targeting civil rights activists, and frankly, that's ongoing, honestly, with Black Lives Matter as well. What is your perspective on how your work fits into that larger picture analysis?
So it actually, I think, was reflective of what was going on and still going on. People assume that because the case was successful, that it was supported right from the very beginning. But that actually wasn't true. It was really only in both of my undercover cases targeting the white supremacists and far-right groups, there was a lot of resistance in management and at headquarters to those cases, and it was only because there were really very effective case agents who did the work to gather the evidence and had the administrative skills to get over every obstacle that those cases were actually approved. And frankly, it was made more dangerous because there were a lot of administrative obstacles that were being thrown in front of us that we had to overcome as I'm working directly with these dangerous individuals. So we were successful, and if you look through the history of the FBI, you'll find cases where similarly effective agents were able to go out and make cases. Even today, there are some good cases you could point to, the investigations against a white supremacist group called the Base, where the FBI can be effective. They have the tools, but it's just not prioritized. So if somebody wants to investigate environmentalists, they don't need to have a lot of evidence suggesting that there's some crime going on. They're given a green light and, in fact, given a national scope in their investigation, where, even in our investigations, even after they became successful and we worked our way into the people who were trafficking in illegal arms, we were constantly being told, stick to your region, the jurisdiction of the field office,
and is your
failing to recognize?
Yeah, sorry, go on.
That these are national groups.
Yeah.
That these groups operate on a national and even international basis. So working them like a local police department would isn't the most effective methodology.
Yeah, and I am curious too. Like, you must have seen what some of your colleagues were able to do when they were, doing work that wasn't combating white supremacy. Like, were you surprised, or was the contrast in the resources and the support that you were given incredibly stark when you looked at the work that other people in your field were doing?
Definitely. And, the first case that I worked in 1992 targeting neo-Nazi skinhead groups in Los Angeles, it was my first undercover operation. So I didn't really know what to expect, and therefore wasn't terribly surprised by bureaucratic obstacles. As everybody in the FBI used to say, bureaucracy is our middle name. and all cases have those problems, but it was really only in talking to other undercover agents, particularly agents working drugs, where there was just flush with money and authorities, and nobody blinked at traveling around the world. I recognized it was contrast, but I figured as a program, the domestic terrorism program was learning how to do an operation like that. So it was expected that they would be a little cautious in how they went about it and miserly with using resources to avoid criticism. But then when I continued working undercover cases and continued to see the same kind of bureaucratic resistance, I recognized that this was a deeper problem.
And is that really what motivated you to leave the FBI and speak about this more publicly?
So it really came down to a case, a post 9/11 case, where, again, when 9/11 happened, we all recognized the horror of it, but I was hopeful that the silver lining would be that there would be recognition that the counterterrorism program is mismanaged and needs to be revamped and headed in a completely different direction. But instead, what the FBI management decided to do is pretend it was a matter of limits on their intelligence collection, so taking those limits off. But if the problem is mismanagement of information and misunderstanding of information, having more information doesn't solve that problem. It makes it worse. And I became involved in a case that actually involved international terrorists and reaching out to white supremacist terrorists here in the United States, seeking to get some support from them. And the case, like my other two cases, was seriously mismanaged in the initiation. And at the time, the director, Robert Mueller, after some criticism of the FBI's handling of the 9/11 intelligence, said, well, if there's any agents out there that see a counterterrorism case being mismanaged, call headquarters. So I did. They didn't really want you to call headquarters.
Right.
And I was told I would never work undercover again, and then kind of put on the shelf, and realized after 2 years of trying to turn it around that my ability to work on effective cases at the FBI had ended, and it was time for me to find another way to talk about these issues.
I mean, that's well, we're grateful, because then we get to talk to you and pick your brain about some of the things that we don't see behind the scenes, but we only read about, obviously. And your personal account is super consistent with what we've heard and seen in terms of resource allocation within the FBI. I guess now let's talk a bit more about your undercover work and your work with white supremacists. You were interviewed in the for Brennan, and I read that interview about your experience seeing white supremacist groups recruit non-white people, particularly the focus was Latino white supremacists, because right now, Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys was a Cuban American. Nick Fuentes is an open Nazi. Even the neo-Nazi shooter in Texas was of Hispanic descent, and I think that a lot of people feel that that's an incompatible perspective, but
inconsistency.
But in fact, it's clearly a concerted effort by the groups in order to launder their agenda. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure, and I think it's really important to recognize, as they do, that race is a social construct, and who is considered white can vary over time. And particularly with Hispanics, a lot of the white supremacist ideology suggests that it's an ancestry in Western Europe that makes you white. And so many Hispanics have ancestral connections back to Spain. So if somebody had a Spanish surname, they could just say, "Oh, I'm not Latin American.
Right.
My ancestry traces back to Spain, which is in Europe, which makes me white." And there really wasn't a lot of investigation. If somebody claimed that, okay, you're in. And obviously, as white supremacy and far right militancy merge, there are far-right governments all over the world, and there are ethno-nationalist groups all over the world that have different races and are focusing on a different ethnicity that are like-minded with white supremacists, so tend to work in concert with them. But and also human nature is just odd. Sometimes people identify with a group that outwardly hates them, and because race is a social construct, sometimes it's just trying to associate with power. So if white people are the group in power in a particular country, and I'm not white, I might want to assist them just for the short-term protection that gives me, hoping that things will change before the race war starts that they're trying to start. So there have always been people with Jewish backgrounds, people with multiracial backgrounds who've been part of these movements.
Yeah, and I think people think of the Chappelle skit of Clayton Bigsby, right, of the black white supremacist, but it really is obviously more complex than that. Would you say it's this desire to be close to a sense of power that draws from their end people into it? I mean, based on your undercover work, what did you see was really the hook for non-white people to be associated with something like this?
Well, really the hook for all of them, for the groups that I was infiltrating, the part of the white supremacist movement that was openly participating in criminality and violence, a lot of them were just criminals.
Right.
And, there aren't too many, if you try to join some local social club and tell them about your love of bomb making, you're probably not going to be very popular. But if you find this group, you'll be very popular, and they'll let help you expand your interest in bomb making. So there were a lot of people who really weren't that interested in reading Mein Kampf, but were interested in committing violence, and that's what attracted them to the movement. So, like any other group, you wouldn't expect some 19 or 20-year-old Marine to understand the geopolitics of whatever invasion or police action that they're involved in. They're more mission-oriented, and if when one of my cases, tracing who were engaging in illegal weapons trafficking, they took me to Asian arms dealers, and they wouldn't say, that violates my ideological goals to actively engage with other racial groups. That's not how it works. They have guns. We want guns. We're going to get them. Right.
I mean, and how does this recruitment effort fit into broader, the branding of these groups? Because what's the group that advertised itself as a drinking club? Is it the Proud Boys?
Oh, right, the Proud Boys.
It's the Proud Boys. Yeah.
Right, and a lot of groups, particularly the far-right militias, try to have a more palatable public positioning. So they'll claim not to be white supremacists, and the Proud Boys were very much practiced in that and called themselves instead Western chauvinists, which is kind of just a semantic trick, right? They're talking about the supremacy of Western Europe, which is white. Obviously they could point to individual members who might not fit the public perception of who is white, but their activity was hand in glove with other white supremacist groups when they were committing crimes. So it was a distinction without a difference. And there have always been groups like that. And, particularly as the far-right movement has received more public attention and is trying to expand its reach, one of the popular T-shirts is Pinochet did nothing wrong, embracing South American fascism. and ethnonationalism that helps them find partners in their efforts to move their agenda forward.
I mean, and it fits very nicely, unfortunately, with the global fascism effort that we're seeing, whether it be Bolsonaro in Brazil, whether it be Erdogan in Turkey, whether it be what's the guy of Hungary? Orban in Hungary. There is a message discipline, but with those governments, and you'll hear the same. You heard the same stuff that Trump was saying coming out of Bolsonaro's mouth, essentially, and like Tucker Carlson's going to Hungary to do these interviews, and the internationalism is also a part of, I would imagine, the strategy of this.
Exactly, and always has been, right? If you go back to the original Nazis, and it always frustrates me when you hear FBI management talk about white supremacy as domestic violent extremism, because it's a domestic ideology. We didn't invent Nazis.
Yeah,
right? It's always been an international ideology and international in action as well. And the original Nazi Germany was allied with the Axis power, which included Japan, and had positive relationships with some Arab countries. So it's a misinterpretation of both history and their ideology that would make somebody believe that this is a problem that is domestic in nature. It only occurs in the United States. I mean, it's fascinating when I mentioned the base cases. One of the individuals arrested was a Canadian military deserter who had come across the border to participate in the plot, and an FBI official identified him as an example of international domestic terrorism, which
right.
kind of shows how it's a very confused lexicon.
Yeah, it should be contradictory, but it's just like, I mean, lastly here, you talked about in your interview how this effort to brand themselves and have non-white people in their ranks, this is a part of their, I think, public-facing brand, but also a way for them to skirt under some classifications made by federal law enforcement when it comes to domestic terrorism and white supremacist violence. Can you flesh that out a little bit for our listeners?
Sure. And just quickly, as the Latino population of the United States grows, the distribution of power will change, and who will be considered white will expand. And of course, there are already many ethnicity or Hispanic is an ethnicity, not a race, and there are white Hispanics and black Hispanics and Asian Hispanics. But who the movement considers white will expand as well to incorporate them, because they need numbers and they need supporters. So they will recruit in communities that are achieving more equity in the society. Because I think the law enforcement agencies still misunderstand how the ideology works in practice with the white supremacists, the violent white supremacists and far-right militants. It's easy for them to mistake what is happening and overlook somebody because they don't fit their idea of what these groups do rather than the reality of what they do.
Mike German, fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program. You can pick up his book, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide: How the New FBI Damages Democracy, and be on the lookout for his next book coming next year. Thanks so much, Mike, for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thank you.